The first image is not beautiful. It is not polished, restored, or made to impress us. It is a grainy black and white photograph, creased at the corners, stamped with a word that changes the way we look at it. Confidential. On the table in that photograph sits an object pulled from the earth, catalogued by human hands, then slowly removed from ordinary memory. Not destroyed, not necessarily disproven, but displaced. Why do some discoveries enter museums under glass, while others vanish into private collections, locked archives, disputed reports, or footnotes too small for most people to notice? Today, we are not chasing fantasy. We are looking at a more difficult question. What happens when real photographs, old reports, and contested artifacts suggest that the story of the ancient world may be less complete than we were taught? Some of these objects may have ordinary explanations. Some may have been misunderstood. A few may be fragments of a history still waiting for the right question. And by the end, the mystery may not be whether every artifact is real, but why human beings are so afraid of an unfinished past. It often begins in a forgotten room, not in a dramatic excavation. A cabinet drawer slides open. Inside are envelopes, negatives, inventory cards, faded newspaper clippings, and photographs labeled in careful handwriting. The power of an archival photograph is not that it proves everything. It does something quieter. It proves that someone once stood close enough to the object to record it. A lens was pointed, a number was written, a file was opened. And then sometimes the trail becomes strangely thin. That is why transparency matters. When an image is real, it deserves to be called an archival photo. When a missing object must be reconstructed or visualized, it should be called an illustration. This distinction may seem small, but it is the line between storytelling and confusion. The ancient world already contains enough wonder without decoration. Bronze gears pulled from a shipwreck, clay jars with traces of unusual materials, maps that appear to remember coastlines in unexpected ways, stones, bones, metals, and marks that refuse to sit comfortably inside a simple timeline. Still, a photograph is only the beginning. Every object asks for context, and every missing record invites caution. The first artifact on our list is a machine from the sea, a device so intricate that even when it was found, many could not believe it belonged to the ancient world. Number 10 begins beneath the water, in the dark weight of a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera. Sponge divers found the wreck in 1900, and among statues, amphorae, and corroded fragments came something less immediately graceful, a lump of bronze and wood fused by time. Only later did researchers realize that inside the damage were gears, not rough wheels, but a complex mechanical system built to model the movements of the heavens. The Antikythera mechanism did not disappear completely. It survived, studied, and displayed, but its implications were so unusual that it seemed to vanish for decades into a zone between admiration and disbelief. Here was a machine from roughly 2,000 years ago, connected not to war or farming, but to calculation. It suggested a world where artisans could translate the sky into bronze teeth and rotating dials. The hidden truth, if we can call it that, was not necessarily a cover-up. It was the discomfort of realizing that ancient technology could be far more refined than modern expectation allowed. The mechanism reminds us that history can be underestimated without being intentionally erased. A photograph of its corroded fragments may look almost ordinary, yet inside that ruin is a lost confidence in precision. If one machine survived by accident at sea, how many others dissolved on land without leaving even a shadow? Number 9 looks almost too modest to matter. A clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces that have led some people to call it the Baghdad Battery. Found in the region of modern Iraq and associated with ancient Mesopotamian or Parthian-era contexts, the object has long lived in the uneasy space between archaeology and imagination. Some have suggested it may have produced a small electrical current, perhaps for electroplating or ritual display. Others argue the interpretation is weak, that it may have been used for storing scrolls, materials, or something entirely ordinary. The evidence remains incomplete, and the loss of context around many early finds makes certainty difficult. What gives the object its lasting power is not proof of ancient electricity. It is the way one small artifact reveals how much depends on context. Remove an object from its excavation layer, separate it from neighboring materials, damage the archive, and suddenly interpretation becomes a room full of echoes. In some retellings, the object vanished from public confidence because it was inconvenient. A more careful reading is that it became trapped between possibility and overstatement. That may be even more revealing. History does not always hide by being locked away. Sometimes it hides beneath claims so loud that the quieter evidence can no longer be heard. And that leads to another kind of artifact, one not lost at all, but unexplained in a very different way. Number 8 is small enough to hold in one hand and strange enough to fill decades of speculation. The Roman dodecahedron is a hollow bronze object with 12 flat faces, circular holes of different sizes, and small knobs at the corners. Dozens have been found across regions once touched by the Roman Empire. They appear in museums, auction records, excavation reports, and private collections. Yet no ancient text clearly tells us what they were for. Were they measuring devices, candle holders, religious objects, gaming pieces, tools for textile work, or something else entirely? The mystery here is not disappearance, but silence. The object survives while its meaning does not. It reminds us that physical preservation is not the same as understanding. We can hold the bronze and still lose the gesture that made it useful. In a documentary built on real photographs, this is where honesty matters. The dodecahedron does not need to be inflated into impossible technology. Its power lies in a simpler fact: an entire civilization that wrote laws, poems, military orders, and household accounts left behind an object whose purpose remains uncertain. A person once knew exactly why those holes were different sizes. A person once picked it up without mystery. Now we look at it under museum light and realize that the past is not silent because it has nothing to say. Sometimes it speaks in a language we no longer know how to hear. Number 7 begins with footprints in stone and with one of the most delicate problems in any mystery: the difference between evidence and interpretation. At places like the Paluxy River in Texas, markings in ancient rock have been discussed for years by people who believe they show human footprints near dinosaur tracks. The claim is dramatic, but the scientific interpretation is far more cautious. Many supposed human prints have been explained as eroded dinosaur tracks, natural shapes, or markings altered by weather and expectation. Still, old photographs of these trackways continue to circulate because they touch something deep in the imagination: the fear that the timeline is not as secure as it looks. This is the midpoint where the story shifts. The question is no longer simply, was the object real? The photograph may be real, the stone may be real, the tracks may be real, but what do they mean? That distinction is where many mysteries live. A camera records shape, not certainty. A label can guide us, but it can also mislead us. A person who wants wonder may see one thing. A geologist may see another. Between them is not always deception. Sometimes it is the fragile human struggle to read time correctly. And if footprints can become a battlefield of interpretation, imagine what happens when an artifact appears inside coal, stone, or metal, far from where it seems to belong. Number 6 belongs to a category often called out-of-place artifacts, objects said to appear in geological settings where they should not exist. A metal cube in coal, a tool-shaped object inside stone, a screw-like form embedded in ancient material. These stories usually arrive with old newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, or photographs separated from their original context. Some reports have ordinary explanations. A later object may have fallen into a crack. A concretion may look artificial. A tool may have been misdated. In other cases, the chain of custody is too broken to evaluate. The artifact may have passed through too many hands before anyone with training could examine where it came from. Still, these stories persist because they dramatize a real archaeological concern. Context is everything. The layer around an object can matter as much as the object itself. Without that relationship, evidence becomes a sentence cut from a page. It may be authentic, but we no longer know what story it belonged to. The hidden lesson is not that every impossible object is ancient technology. It is that history depends on fragile procedures, labels, locations, photographs, notes, and trust. When those break, certainty breaks with them. A confiscated record, a missing inventory sheet, a vanished specimen, each becomes less like proof and more like a doorway. And some doorways lead not into answers, but into the psychology of belief. Number 5 is not one object but a pattern. Photographs of skulls, bones, tablets, or carved stones whose interpretations grow more dramatic the farther they travel from the excavation site. The Ica stones of Peru are one example often discussed in this world of contested artifacts. Some stones show images that have been interpreted by enthusiasts as humans alongside ancient animals. Yet many researchers have treated the most dramatic examples with skepticism, and the history of production, trade, and alteration around them complicates the story. The point is not to mock curiosity. Curiosity is how discovery begins. The danger is when desire moves faster than evidence. A carved stone can be old. A photograph can be real. A local story can be sincere. But none of those things automatically makes an extraordinary interpretation true. Here, the documentary becomes more human than archaeological. People do not only search for facts, they search for belonging inside time. They want to know that the world is larger than its textbooks, that ancestors were not simple, that the official story has room for surprise. That longing deserves respect, but it also requires discipline. Wonder without caution becomes noise. Caution without wonder becomes blindness. Somewhere between them, an artifact waits to be understood. And then there are objects that do not merely challenge a detail. They seem, at first glance, to challenge the map of the world itself. Number 4 is the Piri Reis map, drawn in the early 16th century by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer. Unlike many disputed artifacts, this one is real, known, and historically significant. The controversy comes from what some observers believe it shows. Parts of the map have been interpreted by some writers as resembling coastlines with surprising accuracy, even suggesting knowledge of Antarctica before its modern discovery or before it was covered by ice. Most scholars approach that claim carefully, noting that old maps often combine accurate reports, guesses, distortions, and inherited geographic traditions. Still, the map carries a haunting quality. It belongs to an era when oceans were opening to imperial navigation, when sailors returned with fragments of coastlines, rumors, measurements, and fear. Cartographers stitched these pieces together like memory itself, precise in one corner, dreamlike in another. The hidden truth may not be that someone possessed impossible knowledge. It may be that map-making was always a negotiation between evidence and imagination. Every coastline drawn by hand was both record and question. A real archival image of the Piri Reis map does not need exaggeration. Its weathered lines already suggest a world in motion, a planet becoming visible to itself. But if one map can stir so much debate, what happens when the disputed evidence is not paper, but the human body enlarged into legend? Number 3 enters through an old American rumor. Giant skeletons discovered in mounds, caves, or remote fields, then allegedly removed by powerful institutions. The Smithsonian is often mentioned in these stories, especially in online comments where viewers speak of missing bones and vanished reports. Careful history requires restraint here. There is no need to turn suspicion into certainty. Many 19th century newspapers published exaggerated accounts, and the language of the time often used giant loosely for unusually tall remains. Some reports may reflect mismeasurement, sensational journalism, fraud, or misunderstanding. Others may preserve hints of real finds that were poorly recorded. Yet the persistence of the story reveals something important. People are not only asking whether giants existed, They are asking whether institutions can be trusted to preserve uncomfortable evidence. That question has emotional weight because museums, universities, and archives are not abstract. They are human systems, made of decisions, funding, reputation, and sometimes failure. When a viewer says a large organization controls the past, the claim may go too far. But beneath it is a legitimate anxiety. Who gets to decide which evidence is remembered? A bone can disappear through accident, neglect, theft, reburial, private collecting, or bureaucracy. Not every loss is concealment, but every loss leaves a wound in the record, and some wounds are large enough for legends to grow inside them. Number 2 is less famous than a golden mask, but more unsettling in a quiet way. An ancient mechanical or metallic object whose photograph survives better than its explanation. Across decades, collectors and local reports have described unusual gears, refined metal pieces, or worked objects found in places that seem older than the technology itself. Some have been later explained, some have been exposed as modern intrusions. Others remain difficult to evaluate because the original find site was disturbed, the records incomplete, or the object privately held. This is where the idea of confiscated records becomes more complicated. A record can be seized during an investigation. A collection can be removed from illegal trade. A museum can restrict access because provenance is uncertain. A file can be closed, not because it reveals a grand mystery, but because the object was handled in a legally or ethically difficult way. That does not make the mystery smaller. It makes it more real. The ancient world has been damaged not only by time, but by looting, war, nationalism, careless collecting, and the market for wonder. An artifact without provenance is like a voice without a body. It may speak, but we cannot tell where it stood when it first began. Before reaching the final object, we have to ask whether the greatest loss is the artifact itself, or the broken chain that once connected it to truth. Number 1 returns us to a simple, uncomfortable image. A real photograph of an artifact, a label beside it, and a gap where the rest of the story should be. The most powerful artifacts in this kind of investigation are not always the most dramatic. Sometimes they are the ones surrounded by absence. A missing catalog number, a blurred museum stamp, a report mentioned in an old clipping but not easily found, a field note that says, "removed for examination," with no clear public follow-up. This is the space where responsible mystery lives. It does not shout. It does not insist that one photograph overturns civilization. It asks a slower question. How much of history depends on records that can be misplaced, restricted, mistranslated, or forgotten? Ancient evidence is fragile because human attention is fragile. Stone survives better than paper. Metal survives better than institutional memory. A clay object may endure for 2,000 years, while the file explaining it can vanish in a generation. By now, the 10 artifacts have formed a pattern. Machines from the sea, jars with uncertain chemistry, bronze shapes without names, footprints debated in stone, metals without context, maps that complicate geography, bones enlarged by rumor, and photographs that outlive certainty. The question is no longer whether every mystery is true. The question is why incomplete evidence pulls so strongly on the human mind. To answer that, we must look beyond the objects and toward ourselves. There is a reason people lean closer when an old photograph appears on screen. A photograph feels like a witness. It carries the texture of a moment when someone believed the object mattered enough to preserve. But photographs can also mislead us, not because they are false, but because they are incomplete. They show surfaces, not excavation layers. They capture shape, not meaning. They freeze a moment but cannot explain what happened before or after the shutter closed. That is why the best historical storytelling must be both open and disciplined. It should leave room for wonder, but it should never pretend uncertainty is proof. It should respect viewers enough to say when an image is archival, when a reconstruction is an illustration, and when a claim remains unresolved. The older we get, the more we understand that truth is not always a single locked door waiting for the right key. Sometimes it is a long corridor of partial evidence, careful correction, and humility. The past does not belong only to institutions, and it does not belong only to rumor. It belongs to everyone willing to look closely without forcing the evidence to say more than it can. If these artifacts teach us anything, it is that history is not finished. It is being handled, labeled, debated, misplaced, recovered, and questioned every day. The final question is not whether mystery survives. It is whether we can survive mystery without losing our honesty. So we return to the first image, the old photograph, the worn paper, the word confidential pressed into the surface like a shadow. Why would an artifact vanish from a museum record, a public archive, or a confident version of history? Sometimes because of secrecy, sometimes because of error, sometimes because the object was stolen, misidentified, reclassified, sold, damaged, or quietly placed in a drawer where no one thought to look again. The simplest explanation is not always the least haunting. What remains is a more mature kind of wonder. Not the demand that every strange object rewrite the past, but the recognition that the past is wider than any single story we inherit. Ancient people were intelligent, observant, inventive, spiritual, practical, and capable of surprises that still challenge our assumptions. The real evidence is not only in bronze gears, clay jars, maps, stones, bones, or disputed photographs. It is also in the human response to them, our suspicion, our longing, our caution, and our need to belong to a story larger than ourselves. Some mysteries will be solved. Some will fade. Some will remain suspended between evidence and imagination, waiting for better tools or a braver question. And perhaps that is enough. History is not a closed book. It is an archive with dust on its edges, light under the door, and somewhere inside a photograph that still asks us to look again.